Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Gilbert Town Council study session for March 7th, 2023. I'll call this meeting to order. We have one item on our agenda this evening, a presentation and discussion by Terry Goddard, Board President for Central Arizona Water Conservation District and with Central Arizona Project. Welcome to our council meeting, Terry. We appreciate you being here. If you could step up to the podium, please. Just push the button, any button. There you go. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Peterson, members of the council. It's a great pleasure to be here and talk to you a little bit about water. And I'm somewhat relieved that my GPS said that by coming over the 60, I would avoid the floods. So we've got water in the extremes, both the shortage and the longage. I want to be sure and recognize April Pinger-Tornquist, who is one of our elected board members on the CAP board. She's from Gilbert, so you're well represented among the 15 board members that are elected to the CAP board. And if she feels like it, I mean, she's here to correct me when I make mistakes and probably add a little something from the Gilbert point of view. But if I can figure out how to do, okay, I wanted to start with kudos. And maybe I could just sort of cut to the end and talk about the crisis on the Colorado. I've got a lot of slides and information about how we got where we are, which may be old hat to all of you. I apologize if that's the case, and I will move fairly quickly through the historical backlog so that we get to the current situation, which is, I think, what you're probably most interested in, and which is truly difficult. And I think I could say perilous, because what we're facing in the Colorado River is an extraordinary reduction in the amount of water available to the users. So we're working toward that. But first, I want to compliment the City Council on what you've done already. I mean, you've done the stage 1 drought. That's appropriate, and I think one of the first to do it. Your shortage management is extraordinary. And your staff is among the very best in the state. So congratulations for that. And apologies too, because some of what I'm going to say, you've already done. And Gilbert has really been out in front. And I particular envy, I guess I would say, for your riparian preserve. I called board member Tornquist a while ago. Well, it was about 2 years ago, actually. We had a long discussion, and she was on the banks of the water there at the Riparian Preserve watching, which kind of birds? Pelicans in Gilbert. Congratulations. But what you've done is truly remarkable. I'm going to go over some facts and figures, a little bit about the basin. Again, I will do this lickety-split because I think we need to get to the shortage questions very quickly. So you know what the CAP is, 336 miles of aqueduct from Parker and the Colorado River to south of Tucson. It's an amazing engineering feat. Many thought it was never possible to move water almost 3,000 feet uphill. We're 336 miles. We've got 10 siphons, 4 tunnels. It's an amazing piece of work. But what I like to think of it as is as a river in reverse. Most rivers flow downhill. This one flows uphill. But I'll have more to say about that soon, because I think it's one of our hidden strengths here in Central Arizona is that we do have this river, which together with Salt River Project basically reaches into all the corners of Maricopa County and also Pinal and Pima. Our service area is the center 3 counties in the state. It's not the state of Arizona. But we do have 80% of the population and 80% of the economy served by CAP, Colorado River Water. Your contracts, and I've got them all listed here, what you've done in Gilbert is really a terrific piece of investment in water futures. You've diversified the total picture. You have approximately 1/3 from the CAP, 1/3 from Salt River, 1/3 from other sources, including reclaimed water. And I wish everybody was in as good shape as you've been able to prepare for. Our governance, as I mentioned quickly, is we have 15 elected members, 4 from Pima, 1 from Pinal, and 10 from Maricopa. And we do, on occasion, we have the option of doing a weighted vote. We haven't done that since I've been president, and I hope we never do, because most of our decisions are unanimous. Okay, getting into the river itself, a few miles from here, but a very important part of our total water supply. Back in 1922, 101 years ago, 7 men and they're all in this picture, got together and under the chairmanship of Herbert Hoover, who at that time was the Secretary of Commerce, soon to be President of the United States, came to an agreement. And it wasn't easy. It involved basically, to use a Western term, hog-tying the state of California because everybody was worried that if we didn't get a compact on the river, that the growth in population in California was so rapid that under the law of prior appropriations, they would end up taking all of the supply of the Colorado River. So the folks from the other states wanted to get together early and make sure that the river was divided in a way that did not recognize the law of prior appropriation, that actually had another formula, what we now call the law of the river, for dividing the water in the Colorado. And they came to a rough agreement which divided the 7 basin states into 2 separate basins, the upper and lower. Really creative nomenclature here. But the idea behind it was that 7.5 million acre feet would be allocated to the upper basin, and they didn't make their allocations right away. And that 7.5 would go to the 3 states in the lower basin, where Arizona is located, along with Nevada and California. California got the lion's share of that, 4.4 million. We got 2.8. Nevada got, because basically nobody was in Nevada in 1922, they got 300,000 acre feet. And they've been, well, I won't say what they've been doing ever since. But that was an important step forward. Obviously, it was done without federal interference. The folks around the table in Santa Fe, when they did the compact, were absolutely determined that the states in the West would make their own decisions. Now, there are a few problems, and you'll notice that the bottom line on this slide says that Arizona did not ratify this compact until 1944. There was a little backtalk in Arizona. There were 2 really important issues. One was, and I'll turn off my phone. My apologies. One was that it was unclear whether the waters of the Gila River, the Salt and the Verde, were continued part of the Arizona allotment or if they were separate from it. That's 1 million acre feet, so it was a big deal. And there was a lot of concern that if we ratified the compact without knowing the answer to that question, that we were making potentially a huge hit to Arizona's water future. The other one was that most of the population, even then, was in the center of the state, not along the Colorado River. And so we worried that we would not be able to use the full allocation. And that's where the dreams about the Central Arizona Project first started, was how do you get the water up from the river to Central Arizona so it can be used where the population is. There was another little problem, but they didn't know it in 1922, and that was the years that they used to base the 7.5 million acre feet for each basin were very wet years. At the time, they didn't know it because the hydrology was in its infancy. But now we know that those are some of the most abundant years for water in the Colorado, not just in history, but going back into the geological record. So a little mistake there, not through anybody's bad action, but they just took an allocation of the river which was based on incredibly optimistic hydrology. Well, I mentioned that we had to get the water into Central Arizona, and that was a passion for our congressional delegation. And finally, in 1968, they came together, and the Basin Project Act was approved. It has a little hiccup in it, and we'll talk a little more about that, because in order to get past California, which at that time Arizona had, I think, 3 congressmen, California had 46. So there was a little bit of a disproportionate in terms of our representation, and the result being that we had to agree, Arizona had to agree, as getting right at the finish line in order to get California's support, or at least assure their non-opposition. We had to say we would be last in priority on the river. In other words, California could get their whole allocated amount, 4.4 million acre feet, and it would come out of the Central Arizona Project share. Now, those are words that we didn't think would, back in 1968, it didn't seem to be that ominous, because what followed was the construction of the CAP, delivery of water to Central Arizona in 1985, and then I guess in sort of biblical terms, we had some very fat years. We were able to get the full allocation, 1.6 million acre feet, came through the canal, actually 1.5, we got 1.6 because the canal has a little extra room in it, until last year, until 2022. So those years from 85 to 2022 were full production. And Gilbert and other cities used that time taking their allocation, and if they didn't use it, they put it underground, they stored it. Those were the good years. But remember, as we go through this discussion, that we have the junior priority. Here's the basin, the 7 states that I talked about before, and the priorities down in the lower left. And one of the things that came out of what we call the Law of the River, the series of congressional actions and ultimately a very important Supreme Court case, which finally resolved whether Arizona got the Salton Verde as part of the compact or separate from it. And they decided in our favor. It's basically a highly regulated water system now. And there's not many drops in the Colorado system that aren't watched carefully. From the time the snow falls until it gets to the Gulf in Mexico, when it does get that far. But the 2 major assets that we have are the 2 big lakes, Lake Mead and Lake Powell. They operate pretty much together. They're separated by the Grand Canyon, so there's kind of an interesting waterway there. But they are incredible resources. They have the capacity to hold 50 million acre feet between the 2 of them. And the sad part is, and you see it right here, their combined system right now, as of February 21st, and relatively recent, is 18.99 million acre feet, and 5 million of that is what we call dead pool. So you can't pull it out of the lakes. So that means there's about 12 million acre feet that we can actually continue to use. Now, we're not going to get that far down because there's another dynamic going on in these 2 lakes. They're hydro producers. They produce large amounts of hydroelectricity. And when the lake gets to a certain level, the Department of Interior is very worried that something will happen that could, in fact, damage the infrastructure of the hydropower. It's a phenomenon, and April could probably explain it much better than I can. She's an engineer. But basically, when a turbine is partly in the air, partly in the water, it cavitates. And it can, in fact, blow the turbines apart if it's allowed to go on. So there's a question, and we're very close to that moment in the lake's level that they're slowing down the releases because they can't allow it to get below the top of the turbines. So these numbers are, I think you can see very quickly where we are. We call this the bucket chart. We get it every month at the CAP. And it's been a very depressing story ever since 2000. In 2000, the lakes were full, 50 million acre feet. Today, the lakes are at about 1/4 of their capacity. And that includes the whole system going up. You can see up into Colorado, you've got Flaming Gorge, the other big one, but you've got a number of others, Fontanelle, Navajo, Blue Mesa, Morro Point. Smaller lakes don't have anywhere near the capacity. And just as a quick aside, the reason we've had such dependable service, such dependable water resources from the Colorado since 1985 is because of these lakes. I mean, in good times, they store it, and in bad times, they've got it to reserve. And so our customers from CAP have gotten regular deliveries on the day they order the water for the past 30 plus years. Okay, some trouble arose starting in the year 2000 when I said the lakes were full. Well, in the next 4 years, they went down half of that capacity. There was an incredible reduction. And we ended up first getting something called the 2007 guidelines. I'll get to that later. But it was basically a way to share the shortage. so that we weren't going to fight about it. We negotiated those guidelines, and then something that you probably remember called the DCP, the Drought Contingency Plan, was enacted by the Arizona legislature, first by the stakeholders, the cities and the tribes, the mines, and the farmers all got together. And they came up with a way that we could handle the lower basin in times of shortage. And what you see right here, and these are innocent-looking circles, is the result of the Drought Contingency Plan. And when it hits a certain level in Lake Mead, and that level was right here, 1070, that's a tier 1. That means at that moment, 512,000 acre feet are taken off of the CAP supply. That used to be our water. Almost all of it went to agriculture. And many years ago, there was a deal made with Pinal County, our agriculture, and other farmers, that CAP would subsidize their use for the next 25 years if they would give up their rights to that water. And that's essentially what happened when the Tier 1 shortage was imposed. But you got a few other circles there. They get bigger and bigger. You've got the Tier 2, you've got the Tier 2B, which is approximately where we are right now, and Tier 3, which is as far as it went. That's 720. And you figure the CAP can take, under the original allocation, 1.5 million acre feet. So at 720 reduction, we're at about half capacity. And that's probably going to happen next year. In 22, we had a Tier 1, that was the 512 hit. This year, we're in a 2A, which is not on this particular chart, but it's another 80,000 acre feet came off of our allocation. And based on this particular chart, and this is, again, what we see every month, just to go through this quickly, this is the bad news bears from this current month. In other words, this was the February projection. The green is the hopeful line. That's the 10% possibility. The orange is the really pessimistic line. That's 10% of the worst options. And the blue is the probable line. That's all the other possibilities. And we look at those very carefully because you can see the blue stays up above the Tier 3. The blue dotted line in this chart is when we hit Tier 3. That's, I believe, at 1025 on Lake Mead. But you can see by 2024, it's well below that line. That's the most probable, and it's very likely the Secretary of Interior makes this decision that come August of this summer, we will have a decision to go to a Tier 3 shortage. Obviously, we've made the big one already, but what's coming is also serious. Now here, this gives you another graphic impact, and you sort of see how Lake Mead in the graphics design here is affected. We're down there just below 1045. That's a Tier 2B, and then you see Tier 3 is 1025. The more important part of this particular chart is on the right. And that shows what's happened already in the Tier 2 cuts that we're seeing. And you'll notice that we used to have excess capacity. Obviously, that went away right away. Then agriculture is now down 100%. We're not providing water from the Colorado River to agriculture in central Arizona. And then you can see even municipal and tribal, which have the highest priorities, are taking a little bit of a nick right now. And that's where we're most concerned, obviously. That's where the health and safety of our population is dependent. Okay, I mentioned a whole lot of different acronyms. We got one more. Because the Department of Interior said as of May of last year that none of this was working. The drought contingency plan was not enough. Even with a Tier 3, with all of the shortages that were being taken by Arizona. And you'll notice, I left out one critical detail about this particular chart is when you get down to a Tier 2B, California starts putting some water, some shortage into the mix. It's not a lot. And by the time you get to a Tier 3, I believe it's down here, but you have to read the fine print. It's 350,000 acre feet, you see on the left on the California map. Not anywhere near as much as we have to give up, but that is the practical result of the deal that was made when the CAP was passed in 1968. Now we are talking about a supplemental, and this is where the rubber meets the road. This is where hopefully our discussion today will be able to focus. I'm sorry, all the rest has been preamble. We're working right now at the demand of the Bureau of Reclamation, Secretary of Interior, to try to find more cuts. And what they said back in May of last year was that we needed to have 2 to 4 million acre feet of additional water coming out of the lower basin. That's a lot. There's no other way to describe it. We've not been able to do that. The states have met on an almost weekly basis ever since that challenge was put down. And so far, there's not agreement. At the end of January, there was sort of dueling letters because they gave us an interim. The secretary put out a number of options. One was a no action. They have to do this for an environmental impact statement. And the others were very, what should I say, nebulous. But they obviously involved more intense federal action in terms of demanding shortages be taken. And so they're now in part of this required NEPA process. In order to change the 2007 guidelines, they have to go through a full NEPA analysis. The initial posting has been done, and the comments have been made. And here was our comment. We got 6 states, the 6 little ones, got together, and I think the miracle of this particular letter, and I know you can't read the letter, but I'll summarize it very quickly. But the miracle is that we're hanging together. Upper and lower basin have not always gotten along. We've got some very different interests. For years, they have let water go down the river that we ended up using in the lower basin. They're mad about that. I don't know what they intend to do about it, but they think, hey, we've been given up for so long. Now that we're in a shortage, we're frankly not going to do anything to help you. That's part of the negotiation that we're involved in right now. But for the purpose of this letter, which came on the 31st of January, they did pull together. And it basically was, how do we get to the very minimum that the Secretary of Interior has put out? And that is basically focusing on what we call system losses through the canals, through the lakes, through the various systems from the time the water starts in Wyoming and northern Colorado until it gets down to the end of the river. There are serious losses, almost 1.5 million acre feet. It just goes away. Well, that's water nobody gets. And so for many years, because so much was still coming that the upper basin didn't use, we didn't pay any attention to system losses because it was simply not part of the discussion. Now we are. And so one of the big questions is, how do you allocate that? Where does it come out of the various priorities? Do you do the shortages based on the old priority system, or is it on a more equitable basis? And there's a dramatic difference right now in the public sector because California was not able to agree to let me go back into some of the details. The biggest point of our joint statement of the 6 states, the so-called consensus-based agreement, is that we would have an allocation of the system losses basically based on where you are in the system. So if you're taking water off near the Lake Mead, and Nevada is the best example, you have no system losses at all. But as you get down to Yuma, and then the little right-hand turn that the river makes in a form of the All-American Canal and feeds the Imperial Valley, 3.2 million acre feet of water, there's a lot of system losses. So obviously, if we do that as an allocation, it's going to have profound different impacts upon the southern part of the system than for the central part of the system where we get our water for central Arizona. So that's essentially what this letter is saying. And here's the practical impact. And I apologize, this is an eye test, and it's pretty hard to read the various numbers, but take a look at the 2 alternatives and go down to the tier 3, 1025 on the left-hand side. And you can see that under 1025, and that's the health and safety consensus alternative that the 6 states are proposing. Arizona would get seriously cut. We would end up with 1.618 million acre feet left in our share, which was started out at 2.8. So that's That's over 1 million acre-feet loss, most of it coming from the Central Arizona project. But go and look at the same thing in the California alternative. It's 1.376. Sorry, I can't see it, and I'm right on top of it. But the one that really gets at people's attention is go to the bottom line. If we ever got that low on Lake Mead, there's only 600,000 acre-feet left for Arizona under the California plan. Under the more equitable allocation, it's 1.5. That's a very big difference. And so that's what we're arguing about right now. This is not play money or house rules. This is very stark, different approach to how the shortage should be allocated. There will be a shortage, we know that. We planned for it for years. But the bottom line is, how do we manage it? And if you simply use the old priorities based upon first in time, first in right, and the other aspects of the traditional rules in the western states, the California rule probably is the one that would win out. However, I don't believe that's the last statement. Here in Arizona, we've got health and safety water that goes directly to, as it does in Gilbert, to municipal treatment plants. You need that for fire prevention, for toilets and showers, for all the things that keep a community going. And if you total it all up, the CAP produces about 350,000 acre-feet directly to city treatment centers. Now, there's a little glitch in our system, and that is that Tucson doesn't trust anybody. So Tucson gets their water in a little bit different way. 120,000 acre-feet goes to Tucson into the ground, and then they pump it back out again. Because some of you probably know the history. When the CAP first got to Tucson, they threw it into their water supply, not paying any attention to the fact that they reversed the flow in most of the pipes, and it has a very dramatically different chemical composition than what they were using. The result was green water and a recall of the city council. So I just say that as a warning. They survived it, but it was a water disaster. So they get their water in a different way. But you could add that to our 350. I think if you add the Tucson in, that's approximately 450,000 acre-feet in CAP water that is delivered directly to cities for health and safety purposes. And I think that's sacrosanct. I don't see how we can agree to any settlement that doesn't respect that health and safety. In addition, there's almost 500,000 acre-feet, which due to various legal settlements and congressional actions, goes to tribal governments, to tribal entities. We have 11 tribes that are served by the Central Arizona Project. The largest, of course, is your neighbor, Gila River. And they are the water giant of Central Arizona, truly. But the tribal rights are legal rights, and I think in many ways are just as important as the health and safety. And so here, if you add it all up, we're already below that total. If you look at both maps, maybe there's got to be some skinnying up in terms of the consensus version, but the California alternative puts everybody in a very bad situation. And it's in Congress and here locally, we need to confront that, and we need to be very vigilant about what happens. So I'll wrap up very quickly here. What's next? I had a great Steve Benson cartoon that I was going to stick in here, which basically showed the Colorado River empty. But I've spared you that indignity. But we have, and the story of this message, the story of this slide is too little too late. We started in the 2007 guidelines and missed the target. The lakes kept going down. Minute 323 was our agreement with Mexico, which basically brought them into the conversation. The drought contingency plan, those are the big circles that you saw on the previous map, that seemed to be very, very tough medicine. And we've implemented it, and it didn't work. The lakes are still going down. The 500-plus plan is the most recent. That is compensated conservation, which the Department of Water Resources and the CAP have jointly funded, and it's not enough. We've raised the amount of money we needed, and the lakes are still going down. The reason is fairly simple. It's complicated, but that we just have a very different weather pattern over the Rocky Mountains. And right now, I had a great slide also, which has been but you know what's happening. 500 inches of, no, 100 inches of base in Flagstaff. Some amazing hydrology this year, but it's in the wrong basin. It will keep the Salt River Project lakes very full, but we're worried about Lake Mead and Lake Powell, who are still, as of the end of February, are still dropping. It's been better. The inflow to Powell is better than it was the last couple of years, but it's not enough to reverse the trend. We're in I hate to call it a drought, because the last time we had this many days of low rain was 1,200 years ago. So this is kind of a epic event, and it's not likely to go away just with one good rainy season. This is where we're headed. I mentioned the environmental impact statement. It's going to be tough medicine for everybody, but we don't quite know what it's going to look like, whether they'll take the California plan or our plan or some version in between. There's a very high likelihood that one of the disadvantaged parties will file a lawsuit as a result. And our caution on that is not that you can't file a lawsuit, or somebody might. The last time it happened was Arizona v. California. It took 12 years to get a decision out of the United States Supreme Court in a fight between two states over the water of the Colorado River. We do not have the time to go to court for 12 years. So we've got to try to work again on a consensual agreement between the western states. So right now, I think I've covered all the points on this slide. We have the interim guidelines. We put those in place. Right now, we're facing the light brown square, which is the SEIS, Adjusted Colorado River 2007 interim guidelines. That's what we're leading up to right now. The 2007 guidelines had an expiration date of 20 years. So in 2026, we have to adopt a new set of allocations on the river. The 7 states have to do that themselves. That's the preferred route. Or the Department of Interior will tell us how it should be allocated. And I think I speak for most Arizonans saying we'd rather not have that alternative. But it's always in the background. So after that is imposed, we have additional river operations. So here's where Gilbert is already excelling. But this is really the way we're going to have to look at this particular situation. Augmentation, you hear a lot about desalt. That's probably the last option on this particular chart that we want to do, because it is incredibly expensive and involves international treaties. Wheeling, however, is very viable. Wheeling is what you do with the Central Arizona Project Canal, which is only half full. That means other supplies could be negotiated and put into that particular upside down river, the river that flows to Central Arizona. And that's a big part of our hope for the future, is that, for example, Congress just passed an authorization for the Colorado Indian tribes to essentially lease 200,000 acre feet of their water. They can move it from Parker through the canal to Central Arizona to a willing customer. Could be to municipalities. I know people are already talking to them about that. And Mayor, you're looking like we're about out of time, so I'm happy to stop and ask for questions. But you see on this chart what we're already thinking about, what Gilbert's already working on. Conservation, obviously you've done a great job there. Reuse, that means taking city sewage and turning it into usable water. And recovery, again, using that. And we also have almost 12 million acre feet. Gilbert, I think, has 3 that are what you're number 2 in the state for underground stored water. And so that's part of our safety blanket. We can pull that out of the ground using the Central Arizona Project Canal to move it to the place where it's needed. And I'd like to ask April Pinger-Tornquist if she has anything to add to the presentation. What did I leave out?
Good description of what happens to the impellers if they cavitate. So I can't think of anything else.
Okay, thank you. Mayor, I'd be delighted to stop right now and take any questions if I haven't exhausted you and your patience.
Thank you. I appreciate the presentation. We wanted to make sure that we were doing these presentations since we had half of our council is new and water is such a big topic for all of us right now. So we appreciate you coming out, and Board Member Turnquist too for coming out to present to us this evening. Any comments or questions? Councilmember Anderson? I looked right at you.
Just one quick question, Terry, is on that colorful chart that we saw, there's a certain allocation that is listed there for Mexico. Is Mexico on board with the numbers you're seeing there?
Councilman Anderson, that's a great question. Generally, Mexico has been very cooperative. The international treaties, original in 1944, gave Mexico 1.5 million acre feet of assured water at a certain level that they could use it. In other words, the salinity had to be maintained at a level that would not kill the crops. And that's been observed until just recently. The Minute 323 that you saw referred to, that was an amendment to the treaty, which basically called for a proportional cut in the amount of water that went to Mexico. Out of their 1.5, they're now getting about 1.3. We don't know when, let me go back to that very quickly. When the colorful chart hits, Mexico has not yet been discussed with. You notice that they're taking a pretty big hit, especially in our version. As I say, they've been very cooperative, but the international discussions, our general manager is in El Paso for those discussions next week. And so we're waiting, but the talks are ongoing. We don't know.
Any other comments or questions? Councilmember Bongiovanni?
Yeah, I just want to, first of all, thank you for your service to the state of Arizona over many years. And I appreciate the presentation. I wish we didn't have to have it, but I appreciate the information.
I wish you didn't either. Those early years were so good.
Yeah. And that was it. Just wanted to thank you and appreciate the presentation.
Thank you. We appreciate you coming out to Gilbert, presenting to us. I know we have a tough road ahead of us for all of us.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. I think that's exactly right. It would be foolish, and I know you haven't done this, but some have, to simply think, well, it's just a weather phenomenon, it'll be over in a year or two. We think exactly the opposite, that it is, in fact, and I didn't go into hydrologic details, I'm not a hydrologist, but what we know for sure is that the temperature in the Rockies is about 2 to 3 degrees higher than it used to be. And the result is that much less water, even in a normal year, actually gets into the lakes. That's the long and short of it. And the result of good years, we have runoff that are 50% of normal. Mm-hmm. It'll be better this year. We know we've got a good year. But that is not, one swallow doesn't make a spring, and one good spring doesn't make a restoration of a system that has gotten so parched. So you've got about a third in terms of your water allocations. That's very wise, long-range planning. And I think you have to anticipate that the Colorado portion of that will be skinnied down. How much? We don't know. It's going to depend upon these discussions. And frankly, the ability of the states, the 7 states, to put aside some of their immediate needs and their demands and their wishes and do something that benefits the entire basin. And we're not sure yet that we can do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Have a great evening. We appreciate you. Thank you, Tammy, for coming out also. I will go ahead and adjourn this meeting, and we need to move right upstairs.
Good enough, good enough. I've got a great stuffed Eeyore.